I thought about the Iraq war every minute of every day, and I'm not kidding. I mean, maybe sometimes I would like hook up with somebody and, you know, whatever. I wasn't thinking about it then, but I thought about it all the time. I felt like more people should be thinking about it and talking about it and doing something about it. And I started to have this really negative opinion. I just assumed everybody I met was not morally adequate. I wasted a lot of time. I probably wasted a lot of relationships that I could have had with people had I not written them off for being morally inferior to me. If you have a similar trajectory that I did, then you will likely look back on this time and similarly maybe regret wasting a lot of time judging other people for a conflict that they have no control over. I expect you to condemn Israel more than focus on errant mental health issues in America that are dwarfed by IDF murders. What you're saying is that it's unacceptable to delve into any other topic. And I don't know. I don't think people work that way. If we really want to do this game where you can only talk about like one bad thing at a time, and so you have to figure out what the worst bad thing is. The latest estimates that I saw was that over 10 million people in the world are going to die because of these USAID cuts. I mean, what's happening in Gaza is a horrific nightmare. And I think everybody with a conscience and a heart and a soul like hopes and wishes and prays that this ends soon, one way or the other. Well, specifically ends with peace, like a peace solution. You know, most people are on the same page about that. And the polling bears that out, right? But I'm not going to sit here and tell you you shouldn't be talking about Gaza when 10 million people are going to die because of USAID cuts, because that's insane. That would be a crazy thing to say. Like, you can talk about both of these things. And I think it comes from a good place. Like, people want to center Palestinian suffering and they want that to continue in the conversation. They don't want people to forget about Palestinian suffering. So I think it comes from a good place. But in practice, what you're basically doing is using this horrible conflict as a means to like stifle people talking about things that like it shouldn't take a. I don't know what it is. Like, I don't know what it is. I have a sense of what it is. I think I understand where it comes from. I think there's this reflex with people, like a lot of, not all, but like a lot of pro-Palestinian advocates. I think there's this instinct or there's this like instinctual worry that if you acknowledge that somebody over here may be engaged in like really unhinged rhetoric that is bad, that if you acknowledge that it somehow takes away from the larger issue, and it doesn't. It doesn't take away from the issue at all. It doesn't. You can still care just as much about this thing over here and then talk about this thing over here. Sounds like people sweeping genocide under the rug to play games but go off. No, I understand that it sounds like that to you, but I'm saying I think your wires are like crossed right now, because that's not what this means. That's not what the conversation means inherently. It doesn't mean that people are ignoring Palestinian suffering. But I think you're so heavily programmed, probably by your media diet. You know, there's a lot of, I think, creators that talk this way. I've certainly heard Hassan talk this way, where it's like, who does Ethan think he is to talk about his concerns as a Jewish man when these millions of people over here are suffering? Like, that's so selfish of him to do that. And so like, that's not a unique take. I've seen that kind of take over and over again applied to myriad topics, unrelated and related, and it's just not accurate. It's such a flawed way to look at things. Jesus, can I get you to agree that it would be crazy for me to say, stop talking about Gaza, we need to talk about the millions of people dying from the USAID cuts? Would you agree that would be crazy for me to say? Okay, Jesus, well then, fine. If we agree that it would be crazy for me to say, stop talking about Gaza, we need to talk about USAID cuts, then I feel like you're making space for other topics to enter the conversation. I just need people to stop doing this. Stop doing this thing where you're like, don't talk about this other thing because this thing, it's like, we were talking about toxic progressivism a little bit yesterday. And I think this is like one of those, an example of like one of these things that I'm talking about, because Gaza, as fucked up and terrible and horrific as that situation is, that is certainly not the only issue in the world right now. And so if you're going to demand that a particular creator devote X percentage of time talking about this issue, that never ends. So it's like, it's going to end up turning into, there are literally 50,352 relevant issues to discuss. So I need you, like an auction overseer, to just, fire up your stream and just start rattling them off. Do the best you can, try to get through as many of them as you can. It's just a really broken system. It's just not, these are not realistic expectations. Like, people don't work this way. Creators don't work this way. This is a genocide we are funding and arming. Pretty important. Again, through our USAID program, we were able to, specifically, like when we're talking about, what's it called? PEPFAR? George W. Bush, for all the fucked up things he did one of the most spectacular, one of the most amazing things any president has ever done. He saved millions of lives in Africa through this program that he set up. This USAID program. I don't know if it was through USAID, but of course, what is happening and America's involvement in that is a relevant discussion to have. But why is that more relevant than the USAID cuts and the millions of people that are going to die because of that? Like, is that more relevant to you? It's literally one of the best things that any president has done ever. George W. Bush did this thing. I'll explain. You need to not talk about anything else other than Palestine. Otherwise, you clearly hate the Palestinian suffering. I mean, you say that as a joke, but that's the sense that I'm getting from these people. As someone who sees everything from an opposite perspective from you, you are 100% correct here. There's this movie called The Weather Underground. I've talked about this before, but it was a really impactful moment for me. There's this documentary about the Weather Underground, and it's about this group called the Weathermen, who existed in the late 60s and early 70s, kind of at like the height of the anti-war movement. War in Indochina was raging at that time. The death toll was harrowing, and the anti-war movement and the counterculture movement was at a fever pitch. And there was this group of individuals who formed a group called the Weathermen. They got their name from a Bob Dylan song, who said, "You don't need a weatherman to tell you where the wind blows." And it was meant to suggest that these systems of power in America couldn't stop what was coming. And so they were very much dedicated to a revolutionary kind of spirit. And what this group did was they would do government sabotage. They would bomb government buildings when these buildings were empty. I don't think the Weathermen actually killed any people. The only people that they killed were themselves. I think 3 Weathermen died when one of them was making bombs in an apartment that they were in, and the bombs exploded, and then 3 of them died. I don't think they killed any civilians with their violence. But they interviewed former members of the Weathermen, and one of them was, many of them went to prison, and one of them got out of prison and was now a college teacher. I think he had some kind of a relationship with Barack Obama, and the Republican media apparatus really went after Obama for having like a friendship with this guy. But they were interviewing this one guy, and he described what his experience was like as a young man in America watching his country do this, what he felt was really terrible thing. And I feel like most people think that what we did in Vietnam in so many ways, even if you kind of agreed with like the Cold War justification for fighting communism, I think most people agree that what America did in Vietnam, not just Vietnam, but Laos and Cambodia as well, these neighboring countries, was pretty barbaric. We firebombed entire villages, did napalm strikes that killed so many civilians indiscriminately. There was an event called the My Lai Massacre, where a group of American soldiers just straight up murdered with their guns 400 Vietnamese people that lived in a little village. Some truly horrific stuff. And this person, this former member of the Weathermen, described his experience being young as, he said he thought about Vietnam every moment of every day. He would wake up in the morning thinking about the Vietnam War. He would spend his entire day thinking about the Vietnam War. He would go to bed thinking about the Vietnam War. And I saw this movie when I was much younger, and I identified so much with that experience. I became politically conscious after September 11th. And then shortly after that, only a couple years later, we invaded, or a year and a half later, we invaded Iraq under false pretenses. And I thought about the Iraq war every minute of every day. And I'm not kidding. I mean, maybe sometimes I would like hook up with somebody and, you know, whatever. I wasn't thinking about it then, but I thought about it all the time. And I felt like my country was doing this awful thing. And I felt like my country was committing atrocities. I felt like my tax dollars, not that I was making a lot of money back then, but I felt like my tax dollars were going towards a military machine that was inflicting pain and suffering on millions of Iraqis, you know, hundreds of thousands dead, millions dispossessed. And I thought about it every day. Every single day, I thought about it all day. I was this young kind of hippie, you know, I had these 70s sideburns and long unkempt hair and didn't really focus on things like matching colors when putting together my outfit for the day. I was just I was like a new age kind of hippie for a second there. And I see that going on now with young, I think I've talked about this, but maybe you guys have heard me talk about this before, but I've seen that today with a lot of young people that I interact with online, in my chat, on other platforms. And I'm here to tell you that when I look back on that time, I learned a lot. I feel like I expanded my worldview a bit. I felt like it was good to be educated on the things that were happening in the world. But when I look back on that time of being a young man, I wasted so much time. It's not that it, you know, I think it's good to think about suffering that happens in other countries. I'm not saying you shouldn't think about these things, but I wasn't helping the people in Iraq by obsessing about a conflict that I had no control over. And I certainly was not helping myself. And I remember thinking at the time that everybody was just going on with their lives as normal, and we were doing this awful thing. And I felt very bitter at the world. I felt very bitter at my fellow countrymen. I felt like more people should be thinking about it and talking about it and doing something about it. And it made me very jaded. And I started to have this really negative opinion. I just assumed everybody I met was not morally adequate. It made me jitter. It made me jaded, and it made me bitter, and it made me angry. And when I look back on that time, the reality was the people that I was interacting with day to day in my life, these were people that had jobs. These were people that had families. These were people that had the normal stresses and responsibilities of being an adult. I had the benefit of not having kids, not having a serious career that I was focused on. So I had all the time in the world to think about and obsess about this conflict. And I was holding people to this unrealistic standard. And I wasted a lot of time. I probably wasted a lot of relationships that I could have had with people had I not written them off for being morally inferior to me. And when I look back on that and I look at the young people that I interact with today, I see a lot of myself in you guys. I am empathizing with your experience right now. I'm sure you feel pain. You know, I'm not minimizing that pain. I'm not saying it's wrong or bad to feel that pain. I think that's a sign of someone who is empathetic and cares about other people, but I think that some of you guys are taking it too far with the demands that you're putting on other people. Hutch preaching while most of chat is in a war. I think you guys are making this, some of you guys are making the same exact mistake that I made when I was young. That's the observation that I want to make right now. Because I think if you have a similar trajectory that I did, then you will likely look back on this time and similarly maybe regret wasting a lot of time judging other people for a conflict that they have no control over. They don't, the American taxpayer has no say in what happens in Israel. They had no say when Biden was president. They have no say now. But I see you guys putting distance between yourselves and people like me, and it's like a moral distance. You're lifting yourself up on a pedestal. And if you're anything like me, you're kind of addicted to the fight. There's something about that feeling of I'm different. I care more. I care more than other people. I'm different. I can see through the lies and I can see through the blah, 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 blah. And I see a lot of that going on, okay? I relate to that behavior. It doesn't make you more moral. That's the point, though. It doesn't. It doesn't make you more moral than other people. Just because you feel powerless, just because you feel fatigued, drained about the shortcomings of anti-war activism doesn't mean you get to browbeat people who are relentless in their commitments against militarism. You are not enlightened by abstaining from moral outrage. You are simply unprincipled and lack the moral courage we need in this moment. Oh boy, do I see myself in you. Holy moly. I remember what that felt like. I remember. Yeah, that's a good observation, Lizard. The new crop is way more terminally online than young Hutch. I just wasn't online back then. So like, if I was online, I would have been even more extreme. I have no doubt in my mind. If I was online, I would have been even more extreme and angry and jaded, and I would have been more miserable, in other words. I would have been more miserable than I already was, and I was miserable. Bro, you are? I don't know if you... I am definitely not miserable in my life. I would say fairly happy in my life. But Malika, with peace and love, I just want to say you are not fighting imperialism by arguing with people in Twitch chat. That's not praxis. That's just masturbatory. That's what that is. Let's just call it what it is. I'm not above self-indulgent behavior. I'm not judging you for that. But I mean, listen, who doesn't love masturbating? Unless you have some sort of a penis injury or vagina injury or something. I think it's a little interesting to accuse me of not having the moral courage and principles to relentlessly fight the imperialist war machine. If that was true for you, you would not be spending in time chat. You would not be spending time in Twitch chat arguing. You would be using that time to materially fight the empire, I guess. This is not praxis. This is content. You just described yourself with fighting lefties on Twitter. The difference is I'm not claiming to be like morally superior. I think that's the difference. I'm not telling lefties on Twitter that they need to devote a specific percentage of time talking about this or that or this or that. I know what this is. This is just arguing. This is just, I imagine there's a lot of people like me. I like arguing, you know, like if I like the challenge of, this is just banter. That's a good word for it. This is just banter. That's all this is. It's entertainment. It's banter. That's it. When I go to a protest and I'm not streaming, that's me. I'm demonstrating there. That's a different thing, right? When I'm here, this is just banter, right? But it's a very, I would say it's a very confusing time to be an American. We shouldn't understate that, guys. It's a very confusing time to be an American. It is so confusing because there's this ongoing, like never-ending debate about what that even means. There was a clearer picture, especially like in the post-war era, like during the Cold War, things were like very neatly defined. Not to say that it wasn't overly simplistic, and I'm just saying, just identity-wise, people had a stronger sense of what it meant to be an American. Like, we're fucking American. We're not the goddamn Soviets. And in the 21st century, it's just it's such a mess, you know? If you ask one person, what does it mean to be American? Maybe they cite the Constitution, and if you ask another person what it means to be an American, you know, they'll say it's the melting pot of the world. You ask another person what it means to be an American, it means, you can accomplish your dreams and do anything. If you ask another person, it means we're Christian and we're white and we're straight. And if you ask another person, it's, you know, we're the worst government and military force that the world has ever known. You know, and it just goes on, and it's so fragmented and hyper-polarized. There is no consensus on what the national identity is, and it's just confusing and overwhelming, and let's just be clear, unbelievably stupid. I mean, if anything, it's more than just like America got more angry and bitter and polarized. America it's just everything is so fucking stupid in the Trump era. We are forced to listen to this guy talk about fucking windmills killing whales or whatever, and we just have to that's the leader. That's the guy who's setting the conversation, you know? Yeah, it's a tough time. It's a tough time to I think it's a really tough time. I don't envy kids. I don't envy kids at all. I think I probably had it easier growing up. I mean, everybody gets confused, I think, when they're young. That's just a normal part of your formative years as a young adult, figuring out what the world is and who you are in the eyes of other people. And, you know, that's a difficult thing for anyone to unpack, no matter what. But kids these days, Jesus, I would have been a mess. for sure. I might have been one of my own snarkers, you know, if I had the internet when I was young. I would be like you guys, some of you guys that I have issues with from time to time.